were staying with my sister-in-law and her two teenagers while I was pregnant in a house perched on a hillside several miles down a quiet, winding road. The house was elevated with a view of sprawling wooded land that had once been used for hunting. My husband worked long hours from 7 a.m. to 6 p.m., and my brother-in-law was away on offshore work shifts that lasted 14 days. This left me alone for long stretches, often with only the occasional visit from his kids, who would stay with their grandmother during the week. The house itself was nice, but had an unsettling atmosphere. At first, I attributed it to my pregnancy hormones, but the feeling of unease persisted. One afternoon, while I was home alone, I decided to take a shower. As I stood under the water, I felt an inexplicable sensation, as if someone was watching me. I quickly poked my head out from behind the shower curtain and listened carefully. The house was silent. I didn't hear any sounds that suggested anyone was there, so I shrugged it off and finished my shower. Later, while I was in the kitchen, I heard the back door shut with a definitive thud. The door was visible from where I stood, and it was still locked. This was strange because the door led to a steep drop and had no steps, making it almost impossible for someone to exit or enter easily without attracting attention. When my husband came home that evening, I mentioned the strange incident, but he dismissed it as just another weird moment in the house. We went through our usual bedtime routine, locked up, and went to sleep. I'm not sure how long I had been asleep, but I was jolted awake by the blankets being yanked off the bed. My husband was up, flipping on every light in the house and checking every door, cabinet, and closet, brandishing his handgun. He looked terrified. Terrified. I asked him what was wrong, and he said he had heard heavy boots thumping through the house and voices talking, though he couldn't make out what was being said. Despite his thorough search, everything was still locked, and there was no sign of anyone else being there. A few weeks later, while my husband was still working offshore, my niece came to stay with us because her father was away. She was 14 and fearless, or so I thought. One night, she came into our room and asked if she could sleep with us. I noticed her 16-year-old brother curled up on the floor next to the bed. I was puzzled and asked, "Why are you both in our room at 2 a.m?" They hesitated before explaining. My niece said that something in her room laughed at night. I had never liked that room since we moved in, and I had a habit of putting away any laundry I did in there quickly. My nephew added that he had heard knocking on the door of his room when he was trying to sleep on the cot, and had come down to our room with his sister as soon as the knocking stopped. Once again, my husband sprang into action, flipping on every light and searching the house thoroughly. But as before, there was no sign of any intruders or disturbances. Eventually, we decided to move out, and the kids ended up living full-time with their grandmother. My husband later confided that he had heard the same eerie laughter coming from my niece's room, but when he turned on the lights, there was no one there. The experience left us deeply unsettled, and the house's strange atmosphere lingered in our minds long after we left. The unsettling feeling of being watched, the unexplained noises, and the chilling laughter became a part of our shared history, a reminder of the inexplicable occurrences that had haunted us during our time there. My great-uncle Ralph lived in a remote area outside of an old state penitentiary. This was before most people had televisions, so he kept up with news via the radio. One evening, while listening to his usual broadcast, he heard an urgent report about a violent criminal who had escaped from the nearby prison. The man was described as extremely dangerous, with a history of violent assaults and a proclivity for targeting unsuspecting individuals. Ralph, being a cautious man, was deeply unsettled by the news. He lived alone in a modest, weathered home that had seen better days. The furniture was old, the walls creaked with every gust of wind, and the house was surrounded by dense forest, making it feel particularly isolated. That night, after locking all the doors and windows, Ralph decided to turn in early. He had a saggy old mattress on a simple wooden frame. As he settled into bed, he couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. He dismissed it as paranoia, brought on by the unsettling news he'd heard earlier, and tried to put his mind at ease. However, as he lay there, his senses on high alert, he began to feel a strange sensation. It was as if something, or someone, was beneath the bed. The feeling grew more intense, making his skin crawl. He decided he couldn't ignore it any longer. Slowly, he got out of bed, trying not to make a sound. His heart was pounding as he reached for the phone and dialed the local police, explaining his concerns. When the officers arrived, they conducted a thorough search of the house. Ralph, though nervous, tried to stay calm as they examined the bedrooms and the surrounding areas. Finally, one of the officers checked under the bed, where they discovered a man crouched in the shadows. The man, who was later identified as the escaped convict, was holding a large knife he had taken from Ralph's kitchen. The convict had been waiting for Ralph to fall asleep. His plan was to commit a horrific crime, intending to assault Ralph and then end his life. The police later revealed that he had been planning this attack for days, having stalked the area and selected Ralph's home due to its isolation and Ralph's apparent vulnerability. Ralph was deeply shaken by the discovery. The reality of the situation made it clear how close he had come to a terrible fate. From that night on, he made it a habit to check under his bed and secure his home with even greater vigilance. The incident left a lasting impact on him, reminding him of the thin line between safety and danger. The story of that night became a cautionary tale in our family, a stark reminder of the importance of vigilance and preparedness. To this day, whenever I stay in an unfamiliar place, I always make a point of checking under the bed just in case. It's a habit that started with Ralph's chilling encounter and has become a part of how I stay safe in a world where the unexpected can lurk in the most inconspicuous places. I was in the midst of my third year at university, and a group of friends had come to stay with me and my roommate for the New Year celebrations. We had celebrated the night before with a bit too much enthusiasm, and now we were all dealing with the aftermath, a collective hangover that made even the most mundane tasks seem monumental. After a greasy breakfast to help us recover, we decided to take a walk around the neighborhood to clear our heads. The day was crisp and chilly, a typical winter day which only added to our general discomfort. We ended up at a local basketball court, shooting hoops with an old ball we'd found lying in the grass. Among our group were twin brothers. One of them, Eric, was a friend of mine whom I'd known for years. The other, Sean, was someone I'd only met the night before. While Eric was his usual self, laid back and friendly, Sean was a different story. He had seemed perfectly normal during the festivities, but on this day he took on a rather unsettling demeanor. As we played, I noticed Sean kept following me around with a strange, unnerving grin. It was the kind of grin that seemed too wide, too intense. He wasn't actively participating in the game. Instead, he seemed fixated on me, his eyes never leaving my face. Whenever I would back away to join the group, he would trail behind, keeping that eerie smile plastered on his face. When we decided to head back to the apartment, it was just Sean and me walking down the sidewalk behind the others. Out of nowhere, Sean suddenly moved in front of me and dropped to his knees. He stared up at me with that same unsettling look, as if he was about to worship me or something. "Hey, Sean, you okay?" I asked, trying to sound casual. "We're heading back now." Sean didn't respond. He stayed on his knees, looking up at me with his eyes squinted and his face contorted in a way that suggested he was trying to look directly into the sun. It was an odd, almost disturbing sight, but I didn't know how to react. I just stood there, unsure whether to help him up or keep walking. Later that day, when I mentioned Sean's strange behavior to my roommate, he shrugged it off, suggesting that Sean might have been high or simply having a weird day. I didn't think much of it at the time and soon put it out of my mind. A few weeks later, however, we received a call from Eric. The news was grim. Sean had been arrested after an incident at his aunt's house. He had gone there with a knife and, without warning, had attacked her, stabbing her 14 times. Miraculously, she survived, but the attack was brutal and shocking. The case drew significant media attention in our small community. As I followed the story, I came across an article detailing the court proceedings. One of the testimonies struck me deeply. It was revealed that Sean had been suffering from severe schizophrenia and was hearing voices that commanded him to act. According to the testimony, Sean believed with absolute certainty that his aunt was the devil and he had been directed by God to kill her. Reading further, I was struck by a chilling detail. Sean had referred to one of the voices as coming from someone he had met on New Year's Day. It didn't take long for me to realize that the person he was talking about was me. The article described how Sean had been convinced that this voice, this entity, had given him the divine mandate to commit the atrocity. Even though I knew rationally that it was Sean's mental illness and not any real command that had driven him, the realization that he had somehow associated me with this voice left me deeply unsettled. To this day, the memory lingers. It was 22 years ago, but the knowledge that I had somehow been linked to such a horrifying event continues to haunt me. I understand it was a mental illness, a tragedy of the mind rather than anything supernatural. But the fact that my presence, or more precisely, the distorted perception of my presence, played a role in that dark chapter of his life is something I can't easily forget. This happened not too long ago, maybe a few months back, and it still makes my skin crawl just thinking about it. It was a quiet Saturday afternoon, and I was home alone with my dog, Buster, and two of my friend Sam's dogs, Rocky and Luna. Sam had asked me to watch them while he and his girlfriend went on a weekend trip. I figured it would be a nice, relaxing few days. Just me, the dogs, and some peace and quiet. The house I live in is a bit isolated, surrounded by a lot of trees. It's an old place, built decades ago, and has this large open loft upstairs that overlooks the living room. I love the house for its character, but sometimes, especially when you're alone, the creaks and groans of an old building can start to play tricks on your mind. That afternoon, I was lounging on the couch, lost in a book, while Buster, Rocky, and Luna napped lazily at my feet. The house was perfectly still, save for the occasional soft sigh or twitch from one of the dogs as they dreamed. It was the kind of peaceful moment that makes you feel like the world has slowed down around you. Out of nowhere, all three dogs shot up at the same time, their ears perked and eyes fixated on something upstairs. They bolted toward the staircase, barking furiously as they stared up at the loft. I quickly stood, my heart immediately racing, as the sound of their barks echoed through the house. "What's wrong, guys?" I called out, trying to calm them, but they ignored me completely, their barking relentless. The loft was empty, or at least it should have been. I hadn't been up there all day. I walked toward the stairs cautiously, feeling a strange chill creeping up my spine. The dogs kept barking, growing more frantic, as if something was up there, something only they could see. My eyes scanned the loft area, but there was nothing, just the usual furniture and the large, old window that faced the backyard. Then, just as quickly as they'd started, they quieted down, all three dogs now standing stiff, staring up in tense silence. For a moment, the house was eerily quiet again. I exhaled, trying to convince myself it was just the dogs being, well, dogs. Maybe they'd heard a noise outside, a squirrel scurrying by the window, or the groan of an old wooden beam. But before I could fully relax, I heard it. A calm, mocking voice, soft and low, coming from the direction of the loft. Bark! It wasn't a whisper. It wasn't loud, but it was clear, deliberate. The way someone would mimic a dog's bark to get their attention. Except it wasn't playful. It was sinister. The dogs went wild again, barking louder than before, their eyes still locked on the loft as if whatever had spoken was standing right there. My heart pounded in my chest as fear surged through me. That voice wasn't mine, and there was no one else in the house. No one living, anyway. For a split second, I stood frozen at the bottom of the stairs, trying to rationalize what had just happened. Maybe it was a neighbor calling out from outside? No, impossible. My nearest neighbor was over a mile away. The voice was inside. It came from the loft. I grabbed the dog's leashes, my hands shaking as I hooked them on one by one. "Come on," I muttered, trying to sound calm even though my voice trembled. "Let's go for a walk." I wasn't going to wait around to figure out what or who was in my house. I hurried them out the front door and didn't look back until we were halfway down the long driveway. The dogs, thankfully, had calmed down a bit once we were outside, but my nerves were still on edge. I kept glancing over my shoulder as if I expected to see someone watching us from one of the windows. The evening walk turned into a much longer one than usual. I wandered through the woods near my house, trying to shake off the creeping dread that clung to me. It wasn't just that I'd heard a voice, there was something about the way it had spoken, so casual, so taunting. Like whatever it was, it knew it had unsettled me. It wanted to. After what felt like hours, I finally returned to the house, hesitantly stepping inside with the dogs in tow. The loft was still there, unchanged, as quiet and empty as it had always been. I double-checked the windows, the locks on the doors, every corner of the house, but everything seemed normal, except for that lingering chill in the air. For the rest of the night, I couldn't bring myself to sit in the living room where I had heard the voice. I locked myself and the dogs in my bedroom, leaving every light in the house on. Needless to say, I didn't get much sleep. The next morning, I called Sam and asked him to pick up his dogs as soon as he got back. I didn't tell him why. I didn't know how to explain what had happened without sounding crazy. I haven't heard that voice again since, but to this day, I avoid looking up at the loft when I'm home alone. Whatever, or whoever, said bark that day, I'm not sure I ever want to find out. When I was 18, fresh out of high school, I landed a job as a cashier at a small local hardware store. It wasn't the most glamorous job, but it paid the bills and gave me something to do while I figured out what was next in life. The store was always busy on weekends, with people coming in for tools, paint, gardening supplies, and the occasional odd item that had nothing to do with home improvement. One warm summer afternoon, I was working my usual shift at the register when an elderly couple entered the store. They shuffled slowly toward my counter, the man pushing a cart with a single item, a large, shiny wok. The woman, frail and slightly hunched, was on the phone, engaged in a low conversation that I couldn't quite make out. As they approached, the old man, who had to be at least 85, gave me a wide, toothy grin. His face was lined with wrinkles, and his blue eyes twinkled with a strange kind of mischief. I could feel his gaze linger on me as I started to scan the wok. "Do you like Chinese food, young lady?" he asked suddenly, his voice raspy but full of energy. Caught off guard by the question, I smiled politely and nodded. "Yeah, I like Chinese food." "Well, how about this then?" he said, leaning in closer to the counter, his grin widening. "Do you want to go out with me sometime? We could get some Chinese together." He gave me an exaggerated wink. I froze. The smile on my face faltered. Was he serious? His wife was standing right there, though she seemed completely absorbed in her phone call, oblivious to the entire exchange. I let out an awkward laugh, assuming he was just joking. "And no, sir, I don't think so." He seemed unfazed by my response, but there was a flicker of disappointment in his eyes. "Oh, well, that's too bad," he said, sighing heavily as if I had just turned down a lifelong dream. Then he looked over at his wife, who was still chatting away, completely disengaged from what was happening. The man turned back to me, his face now serious. "If you don't want to go out for Chinese, that's fine," he said, leaning in even closer. "But would you at least like to come live in my basement?" My heart stopped. My hands, which had been busily scanning and bagging the wok, froze mid-motion. Did I hear him right? Live in his basement? I glanced up at him, hoping to find a trace of humor in his eyes, some sign that this was all just a bizarre attempt at a joke, but his expression was completely sincere. I swallowed hard, trying to keep my composure. No. No, thank you." The man didn't react right away. He just stared at me for a moment, as if he were genuinely considering why I might turn down such a generous offer. Finally, he gave a small shrug and stepped back, his smile returning as though nothing strange had just transpired. His wife continued her phone conversation without ever acknowledging us, her voice soft and distant. The rest of the transaction played out in an unsettling silence. I rang up the wok, handed him the receipt, and watched as they slowly shuffled out of the store. The old man gave me one last lingering look before they disappeared through the automatic doors. For the rest of my shift, I couldn't shake the feeling of unease that settled over me. I tried to rationalize it. Maybe he was just messing with me. Maybe he was one of those elderly people who didn't quite understand how uncomfortable they could make someone with their outdated sense of humor. Or maybe, and this thought gnawed at me even more, he wasn't joking at all. Maybe he was serious, or maybe something was going on with his mind, for some form of dementia that made him think that kind of offer was normal. But what disturbed me the most was the sincerity in his voice when he asked me to come live in his basement. It didn't feel like a joke. It felt predatory. Over the years, I've thought back to that moment many times. I've wondered what would have happened if I had agreed, if I had followed that old man to his house, to his basement. Would his wife have noticed? Did she know what he was up to? Or was she oblivious to everything? Or worse, was she in on it? The summer after I graduated from high school, I decided to take a solo trip to our family's cabin deep in the Blue Ridge Mountains of Virginia. It was a secluded spot, miles away from any real town, surrounded by dense woods and the quiet that only remote places can offer. My parents hadn't been up there in a while, so I thought it would be a nice getaway before college life began. The cabin held some of my best childhood memories: hiking, swimming in the nearby lake, and watching the stars away from city lights. After an uneventful afternoon of relaxing and hiking, I decided to spend the evening by the lake, watching the sunset over the water. It was serene, with the sky turning shades of orange and purple before finally sinking into a deep black. There was no light pollution here, so once the sun was down, it was truly dark, except for the stars twinkling overhead. Feeling peaceful, I gathered my things and headed back to my car, parked just off a small gravel lot by the lake. As I started driving down the winding mountain road that led back to the cabin, I noticed something strange. After about 10 seconds of reaching the highway speed limit, an old Chevy Tahoe, probably from the late 90s, pulled up behind me, riding dangerously close to my bumper. Its high beams flashed once, then twice, until they stayed on, blinding me through my rearview mirror. The road was narrow, winding through the woods with sharp turns, and it was the dead of night. I sped up, pushing my little car to 60 miles per hour on a road that was marked for 45, but the Tahoe stayed glued to my tail, matching every move. My heart began to race, and I felt my grip tighten on the steering wheel. What the hell were they doing? I'd barely seen another car all day, let alone one tailgating me on this remote stretch of highway. Thinking maybe they were just trying to get around me, I slowed down slightly and pulled off onto a side road, one that led to my family's cabin. There was no reason for anyone else to be turning onto this road. It was just a small community of maybe 30 or 40 houses tucked away in the woods. But to my growing unease, the Tahoe made the turn right behind me. The knot in my stomach tightened. What were the chances? This was no longer a coincidence. I pushed the gas harder, speeding down the narrow road that twisted deeper into the forest. I didn't want to pull into our driveway and let them see where I was staying, so I drove past the cabin and kept going. The road dead-ended near a maintenance area for a nearby nature reserve, but I had no intention of stopping. The Tahoe was still behind me, their high beams flashing intermittently, illuminating the dense trees on either side. I took turn after turn, heading into streets I wasn't familiar with, trying to shake them off. My hands were sweating as I gripped the wheel, my heart pounding in my ears. But no matter where I went, the Tahoe stayed on my tail, following every move like a predator stalking prey. After nearly 15 minutes of this cat-and-mouse chase, I finally caught a break. I saw an intersection up ahead, traffic moving through at a steady pace. I floored it, taking a sharp turn at the last second, just as a few cars passed by, giving me a small window of separation. As soon as I was out of sight, I turned down a side street, pulling into the shadows between two large oak trees. I quickly shut off my headlights and killed the engine, my breath coming in ragged gasps. I sat there in the suffocating darkness, heart pounding, waiting. The Tahoe slowed down as it passed the street I was hiding on. Its headlights swept across the main road, but it didn't turn. Instead, it kept going, disappearing into the night. I waited a few more minutes, my entire body tensed, expecting the truck to come back. When I was sure they were gone, I started the car, but kept the lights off until I reached the cabin. Once there, I parked around the back, away from the road, and hurried inside, locking the door behind me. I went through the house, pulling every curtain and double-checking every lock as if that could somehow protect me from whoever had been following me. That night, I barely slept. Every creak of the cabin, every gust of wind through the trees sent my heart racing again. I kept expecting to see the Tahoe's headlights outside the window or hear the sound of heavy boots on the porch, but nothing came. I never figured out who was driving that truck or why they had followed me so relentlessly that night. Maybe it was some bored locals playing a sick prank on the random girl alone in the woods, or maybe it was something darker, something I'd narrowly escaped by the skin of my teeth. Whatever the reason, That night in the Blue Ridge Mountains left me with an unsettling fear I couldn't shake for a long time. Even now, years later, I still get a chill whenever I drive down an empty road late at night, haunted by the memory of those high beams in my rearview mirror. I was cruising down a remote country road in northern Alabama on my motorcycle, a sleek 750 Vulcan, when I noticed an ambulance heading in the opposite direction. I pulled over to let it pass, but as I did, a pickup truck pulled in behind me. Glancing in my rearview mirror, I saw the passenger door open and a man with a baseball bat start marching towards me. Without hesitation, I dropped the bike into gear and took off. What followed was an adrenaline-fueled chase that felt like it lasted an eternity. The pickup truck was relentless, tailing me closely for about 20 minutes. The road was unfamiliar, and my bike wasn't built for high-speed cornering, so every turn was a gamble. I blew through four-way intersections, desperately trying to put some distance between us. Despite my efforts, they were determined to catch me. Eventually, I managed to head towards a busier highway, hoping to blend in with the traffic and lose them. However, as I reached a bridge, traffic came to a halt. The truck was now just 3 cars behind me, and I knew that if I could just get back to the highway, I could outrun them in a straight line. I saw the passenger weaving through the stopped cars, so I made a risky decision to lane split, which is illegal in Alabama, and shot up the on-ramp. I opened the throttle waddle wide and not looking back. I never returned to that area. As far as I can tell, it was a completely random attack with no apparent provocation. Before the ambulance passed, I hadn't seen another vehicle for a while. I wasn't speeding excessively, and my bike's exhaust wasn't particularly loud. I count myself incredibly lucky for escaping that situation. We lived in a spacious house shaped like an L, but the L was carved into a hillside, giving the score of the L an almost subterranean feel. The lower part of the L was built into the hill, creating a basement-like area with windows that peeked out, while much of it was either embedded in the hillside or nestled beneath another floor. Starting at age 13, I had the room in the lower part of the L. My room had 2 doors, one leading to a sort of recreational space, and the other to an ensuite bathroom. The space always felt eerie, but as a skeptic, I dared whatever might be lurking to confront me. Despite this, I could never sleep well unless both doors were securely shut. When my parents were away, I would occasionally bend the rules and let my dog sleep with me. Several times I woke up to find her alert and staring intensely at the door leading to the recreation room. I also heard scratching sounds on the window screen from time to time. We had a variety of animals: dogs, cats, horses, and even local wildlife like bush turkeys and foxes. So I thought if something were amiss, my dogs would have gone wild. Fast forward 5 years, and I brought my then girlfriend to visit my family. We stayed in that old room, and she woke up screaming between midnight and 3 a.m. on 2 of the 3 nights we were there. We've been together for 5 years since then, but she won't set foot in that house anymore. Around 4 years ago, my younger sister moved into that same room. Recently, she asked if I had ever heard scratching on the window late at night. Both our dogs, the cat and the horses, had passed away by then, so the scratching couldn't be explained by our old pets. She also mentioned that she couldn't sleep unless both doors were shut and would even place doorstops under them to hear if either door opened. She did some research and decided to sage the room. Since then, she's experienced disturbing nightmares and has woken up screaming several times. For context, she was around 14 when my girlfriend had those night terrors, so she was never told about them. Although I consider myself a skeptic, the repeated experiences and unsettling details still give me chills. Thanks for watching. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel, like, comment, and share the video. See you next time.